She was 75 years old when a brass key arrived in the mail tied to a faded blue ribbon she had not seen since she was a girl. It came inside a manila envelope from a town she had not stepped foot in for 58 years. The return address was a name she had long since taught herself not to say out loud. People at the senior center clucked and shook their heads when she told them, "Throw it out, Opal. Let the dead stay dead." Her own daughter begged her not to go. But what none of them knew, not the neighbors, not her daughter, not even Opal herself, was that the brother she had buried in her heart at the age of 17 had been alive the whole time, breathing the same mountain air, just 12 miles down the road. Before we go any further, friend, if stories about the people we lose and the love we never stopped carrying mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe and stay with me. This one is going to take its times the way the best stories do, and I want you here for all of it. The apartment in Asheville was the kind of place a life shrinks into at the end. 3 small rooms on the second floor of a brick building near the highway with a kitchen so narrow, Opal could touch both walls at once if she stretched her arms. The radiator hissed in the corner like an old cat. The window over the sink looked out onto the back of a laundromat, and at night, the dryers turned and turned, throwing slow orange light against her ceiling. She had lived there for 11 years, ever since Harold passed. Harold had been a quiet man, a maintenance supervisor for the public schools with hands that smelled of machine oil and a way of humming under his breath while he read the newspaper. He had loved her steadily for 43 years. And then one Tuesday morning, he simply did not wake up. Opal had folded the obituary into her Bible and learned slowly how to make coffee for one. She was 75 now. Her knees ached in the rain. Her hair, once the color of clover honey, had gone the white of cotton in a field. She wore her glasses on a beaded chain around her neck because she was tired of looking for them. And on Tuesdays and Fridays, she rode the senior shuttle to the community center for chair yoga and a hot lunch. Because if she did not go somewhere twice a week, the apartment began to feel less like a home and more like a waiting room. Her daughter Margaret lived in Charlotte with 2 teenagers and a husband who worked too much. Margaret called every Sunday at 3 o'clock, and every Sunday at 3 o'clock, the call ended the same way. "Mama, there's a beautiful place out in Mooresville, Pine Crest. They have a garden. They have a chapel. You wouldn't have to climb those stairs anymore." Opal would answer with the same gentleness she had used when Margaret was 4 years old and afraid of the dark. "I'm not ready to be put on a shelf, sweetheart." But the truth she did not say out loud was that she could feel herself getting smaller. Some mornings she would stand in the kitchen with a coffee cup in her hand and forget what she had come in for. Some afternoons she would sit on the edge of the bed and feel a strange soft pull toward the pillow, as if her body were already asking permission to lie down for good. It frightened her, not the dying, the forgetting. So when the letter came on a Thursday in late October, slipped through the mail slot, along with a power bill and a flyer for a tire sale, she did not throw it away. She did not even sit down. She stood by the front door in her house slippers, staring at the postmark. Cedar Hollow, North Carolina. She had not seen those words on a piece of paper in 58 years. The envelope was heavy. It carried the weight of something more than paper. She turned it over in her hands twice, and then she carried it to the kitchen table and sat down very slowly, the way a person sits down when they have just heard bad news, but do not yet know what the news is. The letter inside was typed on heavy cream stock, the kind of paper a country lawyer uses when he wants you to understand that what he is saying is real. "Dear Mrs. Whitfield Calloway," it began. "My name is Ellis Hargrove. I have the honor and the sorrow of writing to inform you that your brother Wendell Lee Whitfield passed away in the early morning hours of September the 22nd. He left specific instructions that you and only you were to be notified, and that certain matters of his estate were to be placed directly in your hands. I would be grateful if you could find your way to my office in Cedar Hollow at your earliest convenience." Opal read the letter 3 times. Then she read it a fourth. Then she set it down on the table and pressed both palms flat against the wood, and she sat very still while the radiator hissed and the refrigerator hummed and the small clock on the wall ticked through the longest minute of her life. Wendell. She had not said his name out loud in decades. There had been a time back when she was a young bride, and Harold was courting her when she had tried to explain Wendell to him. I had a brother once, but he ran off and left us when I was 17. That was all she had ever said. That was all she had been told. Their daddy had come into the kitchen one cold morning in the spring of 1968, his face the color of ash, and said, "Your brother's gone, baby." He took the cash box from the feed store and run. "Don't you ever speak his name in this house again." She had cried for 3 days. Then she had stopped. Then she had grown up and married and raised a daughter and buried a husband and turned 75. And in all those years, she had told herself the same quiet lie. He left us. He didn't love us enough to stay. Now there was a letter on her kitchen table saying he had died last month. Last month. Not in 1968, last month. She got up from the table and walked to the window over the sink and put her hand against the cold glass. Outside, the laundromat sign blinked its slow pink letters, and a man in a blue jacket stood by the back door smoking. The world looked the same. The world was not the same. She called Margaret that night, and Margaret tried to talk her out of it. Of course she did, because Margaret loved her and was afraid for her and did not understand what it meant to have a hole in your life suddenly become a door. "Mama, you're 75 years old. You can't go traipsing off into the mountains for some lawyer you've never heard of. What if it's a scam? What if you fall?" "I won't fall. You don't know that." Margaret. "I have spent 58 years not knowing what happened to my brother. If there is a chance, even a small chance, that I get to find out before I go, going to take it." There was a long pause on the line. Opal could hear her grandson laughing somewhere in the background, a sound like a small bell, and her heart pulled toward it. "I'll come with you then." "No, baby, this is mine." She bought a bus ticket the next morning at the Greyhound station downtown. Single fare Asheville to Cedar Hollow by way of 2 transfers and a layover in Hickory. The clerk at the window had to repeat the price twice because Opal's mind kept drifting. She packed a small canvas suitcase with 2 dresses, a sweater, her good shoes, her Bible, a tin of aspirin, and the letter from Mr. Hargrove. She folded a photograph of Harold into the inside pocket so she would not feel alone. The bus left at 6 in the morning, and Opal watched the city give way to small towns and then to the long blue folds of the mountains. The leaves had turned. Whole hillsides burned orange and gold and rust, and the rivers ran dark and slow between them. She had not been back to this country in 58 years. She had told herself she did not miss it. She had been wrong. She arrived in Cedar Hollow just after 3 in the afternoon. The town was almost exactly as she remembered it, which was the strangest thing of all. The feed store had become a hardware store. The drugstore on the corner had a new sign, but the old courthouse still stood on its grassy square, and the maple trees along Main Street were the same maples, only taller, and the smell of wood smoke from someone's chimney was the same smell that had hung over her childhood every October of her life. Ellis Hargrove's office was above the bank. A narrow staircase, a frosted glass door, a name in gold lettering that had been there long enough to fade. He was waiting for her. A small white-haired man in a brown wool suit with hands that trembled slightly when he reached out to take hers. "Mrs. Calloway, Opal will do Mr. Hargrove." "I haven't been Mrs. Calloway in this town a day in my life." He smiled at that, a real smile. The smile of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and is grateful to set it down. He led her into a small office with a window that looked out over the square. He poured her a cup of coffee from a percolator on a side table. He sat down across from her with a thin folder and a heavier wooden box. "I should tell you," he began, "that your brother and I were friends for 37 years. Opal's hand paused on the coffee cup. 37 years, yes, ma'am. She set the cup down very carefully so as not to spill. Mr. Hargrove, my brother, left home in 1968. He was 18 years old. He took the cash box from the feed store and he disappeared. Nobody in my family ever heard from him again. I have spent the better part of my life believing he was dead, and the rest of it believing he was lost. Are you telling me you knew him? I am telling you that I knew a man named Walter Reed who came down out of the hills once a month for 37 years to buy supplies and to sit on my porch and play checkers, and who told me on the last good night before he passed that his real name was Wendell Whitfield, and that he had a sister named Opal May, and that I was to find her and put this into her hands. He slid the wooden box across the desk. The box was old. The lid was carved with the rough shape of a dogwood blossom, and the hinges were brass, and there was a small wax seal pressed over the latch with the letter W stamped into it. Opal stared at it. He didn't die in 1968, she said. No, ma'am, he lived here. He lived 12 miles from this office. For 58 years. He did. She did not cry. She thought she might. She thought she should. But what rose up in her instead was something stranger than grief. Something closer to vertigo, as if the floor of her life had just dropped 6 inches, and she was learning in real time to stand on the new floor. When did he pass? September 22nd. In his sleep. He had been sick a long time. He knew it was coming. He spent the last 3 months getting his affairs in order. And he made me promise, Mrs. Calloway, he made me swear on my own father's grave that the moment he was gone, you would be told. Why did he wait so long? Mr. Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were very pale and very tired and very kind. That he said gently is for the box to tell you. She broke the wax seal with a thumbnail. The latch gave way with a small soft click. She lifted the lid. Inside, on a folded square of white linen, lay 3 things. A brass key dark with age about the length of a finger. A piece of blue grosgrain ribbon faded almost to gray, frayed at both ends. And a folded piece of parchment sealed again with wax and addressed in a tight, careful hand to my sister Opal May. Her breath went out of her all at once. She picked up the ribbon first. She knew it. She knew it the way you know the sound of your own mother's voice. It was the ribbon she had worn in her hair the summer she turned 7, the summer Wendell had taken her down to the river to teach her how to skip stones. She had lost it that fall. She had cried about it for a week. She had blamed the dog. He had had it the whole time. He had kept it for 68 years. She brought the ribbon up to her face, and now the tears came quiet and slow. The way the rain comes in the mountains in October, without any warning at all. Mr. Hargrove handed her a clean handkerchief from his breast pocket and waited. After a while, she lifted her head. What does the key open? He shook his head. I don't know, Mrs. Calloway. He never told me. He only told me that you would find the door and that the door would tell you the rest. There is a hand-drawn map inside the parchment. He asked me to put you up at the inn here in town tonight and to lend you the use of my truck in the morning. The property is your family's old homestead, the one your father lost in '74. Wendell bought it back piece by piece, parcel by parcel over 30 years. It belongs to you now, free and clear. Opal looked down at the brass key in her hand. She tied the blue ribbon through the hole at its top with fingers that remembered somehow how to make the small bow her mother had taught her. She slipped the ribbon over her wrist so the key hung against the inside of her arm like a small warm weight. I'll need the truck at first light, she said. Yes, ma'am. And Mr. Hargrove, one more thing. Anything. Did he ever, in all those years, did he ever say why he stayed away? The old lawyer was quiet for a long time. He looked down at his own hands. When he spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. He said the porch light was the only thing he could give you. Opal did not understand, not yet. But she felt the words settle into her chest the way a stone settles into the bed of a river slowly and for a long time. She stayed that night at the Hollow Inn, a 6-room boarding house on the edge of town, run by a woman who remembered her mother. Opal lay awake until almost 2 in the morning, the key on its ribbon resting against her collarbone, listening to the wind move through the maples outside her window. She thought she would not sleep at all. But sleep came at last, and with it a dream she had not had since she was 17. In the dream, she was walking down the hill behind the old barn at twilight, and Wendell was up ahead of her on the path. His back turned, and he was saying something she could not quite hear. And the porch light of the farmhouse glowed yellow and warm in the distance, and no matter how fast she walked, she could not catch him. She woke at 5:30. She dressed in her warmest sweater and her sturdy shoes. She drank a cup of coffee on the inn's small porch in the dark, and she watched the sky go pale over the ridges, and she said a small prayer for the courage to see whatever it was she had come here to see. Mr. Hargrove's truck was an old green Ford with a bench seat and a heater that took its time. He had drawn directions for her on the back of an envelope and circled the spot in red. Old Whitfield Road, 3 miles past the Mercer Place gates chained, but the chains being cut. You'll see the chimney through the trees. She drove slowly. Her hands were not as steady on the wheel as they had once been, but the road came back to her the way an old hymn comes back, every curve, every dip, every stand of laurel and rhododendron. She passed the schoolhouse where she had learned to read. She passed the bridge where her cousin Jenny had once fallen in and come up laughing. She passed the cemetery where her parents were buried, and she did not slow down. The old gate was right where Mr. Hargrove said it would be. The chain had indeed been cut, and the cut looked recent, the metal still bright where the bolt cutters had bitten through. Wendell, she thought. He had walked this road one last time, knowing he would not walk it again. He had cut the chain for her. She pulled the truck onto the grass and got out. The homestead lay ahead of her at the bottom of a long sloping meadow, what was left of it. The farmhouse had collapsed in on itself some years before. Only the stone chimney still stood blackened and tall, pointing at the sky like a finger that had forgotten what it was pointing at. The barn was gone entirely. The orchard her grandfather had planted was a tangle of wild apple trees and choking vines. She stood at the top of the meadow with the brass key warm against her wrist, and she let herself look. She had not seen this land in 58 years. The last time she had stood here, she had been 17, and her mother had been alive and her brother had been alive, or so she had thought, and the world had been a place she still half believed in. She walked down to the chimney first. She put her hand on the cold stones. She said very quietly the names of everyone she had lost in this place. Then she took the parchment from her coat pocket and unfolded it. The map was simple. A circle for the chimney, a line for the creek, a small square set back into the hill behind where the smokehouse used to stand, marked with an X. Beneath the X in Wendell's careful hand were 3 lines. The door is in the hill behind the old smokehouse. The key fits only 1 lock. Trust what you find. She walked the path through the brush. The smokehouse had fallen in on itself decades ago, just a heap of mossy timbers and a scatter of fieldstones. But behind it, set into the rising bank of the hillside, half hidden by brambles and a curtain of trailing ivy, was a wall of poured concrete. She had to push aside a thick mat of vine to find it, and there in the center of the wall was a heavy steel door, the color of old iron, set flush into the hill. There was no handle, only a keyhole. Opal's breath came short. She slipped the ribbon from her wrist. She held the key in both hands. She fitted it to the lock. It would not turn at first. She had to lean her shoulder against the door and try again. And this time the key turned with a low metallic groan, and something heavy inside the door shifted, and the cold air of a sealed room sighed out around the edges of the frame. She pulled. The door was heavier than she expected, but it moved, scraping against the stone of its threshold, and she stepped through into the dark. She had brought a flashlight. She switched it on. The beam picked out a small concrete room set into the hill, perhaps 10 feet square, with a single cot along one wall, a wooden table, a shelf of canned goods, a kerosene lantern hanging from a hook. The air smelled of cedar and old paper. and the faint mineral tang of the earth pressing in from outside. It was not a hiding place. It was a home, a small patient waiting home. Someone had swept the floor not long ago. Someone had laid a folded quilt at the foot of the cot. Someone had set on the corner of the wooden table a tin coffee cup and a small clay vase with 3 dried wildflowers in it. He had been getting it ready. He had been getting it ready for her. On the table, weighed down by a smooth river stone, lay a stack of envelopes tied with twine. There were dozens of them. The one on top had been set apart from the rest. It bore a single word: first. Opal sat down on the edge of the cot. The springs creaked beneath her. She untied the twine with the hands that would not quite stop shaking. She broke the seal on the first letter, and she unfolded the pages, and by the steady yellow light of the flashlight, she began to read. "My dearest Opal," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are an old woman now. And so am I, or so I was, and I am so very sorry for the years. I want to tell you first that I never stopped loving you. Not for one single day of the 58 that have passed since I last saw your face. I want to tell you that I have written you a letter on every birthday of your life, and that they are all here in this room waiting for you. I want to tell you that the porch light I lit for you the night I left has been burning somewhere every night since. But before any of that, sister, I have to tell you the truth. Because the truth is the only thing I have left to give you, and you have waited a long time to hear it. I did not run away in the spring of 1968. Daddy and I let you believe I did because the lie was the only thing keeping you alive." Opal stopped reading. The flashlight trembled in her hand. Somewhere behind her eyes, the way a long-buried thing rises slowly through dark water, a memory began to surface. She had not thought of it in 58 years. She had not even known she remembered it. She was 16 years old. It was the night before Wendell disappeared. She had been coming back from the hen house in the dark with a basket of eggs, and she had passed by the open door of the barn, and inside the barn by the yellow light of a single hanging bulb. Her father had been standing very close to another man, and the other man had been holding her father by the front of his shirt, and the other man's voice had been low and even, and the words she had heard and then forgotten and now remembered had been these: "If that girl ever opens her mouth about what she saw at my place last Sunday, Calvin, I will bury her in the same hole." The man holding her father had been Silas Thorne. The brass key felt suddenly very cold against her palm. The blue ribbon on her wrist felt suddenly very heavy. The room around her, the cot, the table, the small clay vase of dried wildflowers. All of it tilted gently the way the deck of a boat tilts when a great wave is passing underneath. She looked down at the letter. She turned the page with fingers that no longer felt like hers. And there, in her brother's careful, patient, unhurried hand, were the next lines. "You saw something at the Thorne place that Sunday, sister, when you walked over to bring back Mama's mixing bowl. You saw something you were not supposed to see. You came home and you went straight to bed. And by the time you woke up the next morning, the part of your mind that holds such things had quietly folded it away because you were 16 years old, and the human heart at 16 knows how to protect itself from a thing it cannot yet carry. But Silas Thorne knew you had seen. And Silas Thorne told Daddy that one of us was going to take the blame for what happened on his place that Sunday, or he was going to take you." The flashlight slipped out of Opal's hand and rolled across the concrete floor, and the beam swung across the wall. And for one long moment, the only sound in the small earthen room was the sound of her own breathing, ragged and shallow, and the faint faraway whisper of the wind moving through the maples on the hillside above her. The same wind that had been moving through those maples on the spring night 58 years ago when her brother had walked down out of the meadow and out of her life, and had not, it turned out, ever truly left at all. She did not know how long she sat there in the dark with the flashlight rolling small, slow arcs of light across the concrete floor. Long enough for her hands to stop shaking. Long enough for the cold of the earth to come up through the soles of her shoes and settle in her ankles. Long enough for the part of her that had spent 58 years being a sensible widow to step quietly aside and let the part of her that was still a 16-year-old girl with a basket of eggs walk forward and pick up the flashlight from the floor. She read the rest of the letter. She read it slowly, the way you read scripture at a graveside, one line at a time. He told her what she had seen at the Thorn place that Sunday, and he told her how their father had come into Wendell's room at midnight with a face like a man already drowned, and he told her how the two of them, father and son, had stood in the kitchen until dawn and made the only deal a frightened man and a brave boy can make. Wendell would take the blame for a theft that had not happened. Wendell would disappear. Silas Thorne would believe the witness had been silenced, and Opal in her bed down the hall would go on living and would never know. He had not been able to write to her. A letter postmarked from anywhere would have told Silas Thorne he was still alive, and a brother still alive could be made to talk, and a sister who had a brother to talk could not be left walking around. So he had stayed close. Close enough to watch the house from the ridge with a pair of binoculars on her birthday every year. Close enough to drive by her wedding to Harold from a back road and see her come out of the church in her mother's dress. Close enough to sit in a parked truck on the shoulder of Route 19 the night she brought Margaret home from the hospital in Asheville, just to see the small white blanket in her arms through the window of her own car as she passed. He had loved her. He wrote the way you love a candle you have set in a window, quietly, from a great distance, and without ever once daring to open the door. She folded the letter when she was done. She put it back inside its envelope. She tied the twine again around the whole stack as carefully as if it were a bouquet. Then she stood up and walked very deliberately out of the small concrete room and up into the gray October light of the meadow above. She closed the steel door behind her and locked it with the brass key, and she stood for a long moment with her hand flat against the cold metal, the way a person stands at the closed lid of a coffin before they walk away from a grave. She did not walk away. She walked back down to the truck, took the canvas suitcase from the passenger seat, and carried it up the meadow and through the brush, and back down into the room she had only just discovered. She set it on the wooden table next to the tin coffee cup and the small clay vase with its 3 dried wildflowers. She unfolded the quilt at the foot of the cot and shook the dust from it. She lit the kerosene lantern with a match from the shelf and turned the wick down low, and the small room filled with a soft amber light that smelled faintly of the past. She would not sleep in town tonight. She would sleep where her brother had meant her to sleep. She would sleep in the only home he had been able to leave her. She lay down on the cot in her sweater and her sturdy shoes, and she pulled the quilt up to her chin, and she said her prayers, the same prayers her mother had taught her, on her knees at the foot of a brass bed in a farmhouse that no longer stood. And the brass key, warm on its blue ribbon against the inside of her wrist, kept time with her breath until at last she slept. She woke at dawn to a body that did not entirely belong to her. Her hips ached. Her right knee felt as if someone had spent the night quietly tightening screws inside it. She sat up on the edge of the cot and put a hand against the small of her back and made the soft involuntary sound a person makes when they are 75 and have slept on a cot in a hole in the ground. She laughed at herself. It came out almost a cough, but it was a laugh. She drank cold water from a jug on the shelf. She ate 2 of the crackers she had packed for the bus ride. Then she climbed back up into the meadow with a pair of pruning shears she had found hanging from a nail by the door. And she set herself to the only work she could think of, which was to begin clearing the path between the chimney and the door of the room. It was bad work for an old woman. She knew it was bad work. The brambles were thick as her wrist in places, and the vines had grown into the brush in stubborn coils. And within 15 minutes, she was sweating under her sweater, and her hands were trembling. She kept at it. She cut, she pulled, she dragged the cut brush into a pile by the foundation of the smokehouse. She told herself she was not too old. She told herself this was hers to do. She told herself wrong. She did not see the root. It was bedded under a mat of dead leaves, dark and curved and slick with the morning's damp. And when her left shoe came down on it, Her ankle turned with a small, bright, sickening pop, and she went down sideways into the brambles with a cry that startled a crow out of the tall pines. She lay there for a moment looking up at the sky. The sky was the pale, unbothered blue of an October morning in the mountains. It was the sky her mother had hung sheets under. It was the sky she had been married beneath. It will not, she thought, be the sky I die under. Not today. She rolled onto her side. She put both hands flat in the wet grass. She pushed herself up onto her good knee and then very slowly onto both feet, and she stood swaying for a long moment with the cold sweat of pain breaking out along her hairline. Her ankle was already swelling against the top of her shoe. She would not be able to walk far. She would not have to. The sound of a truck engine came up the road just then, slow and old and easy. She heard it long before she saw it. A rust-colored Chevrolet pickup, perhaps from the late 70s, with one headlight set slightly higher than the other, came creeping along the grass beside the cut chain at the gate and rolled to a stop beside Mr. Hargrove's Ford. The man who climbed out of the cab was nearly as old as she was. He was tall and stooped in the shoulders with a white beard cut close to a brown face, and he wore a barn coat that had seen 40 winters. He carried a thermos in one hand and a folded paper sack in the other. He looked up the meadow at her, and he did not hurry. He came up the slope at the slow, steady pace of a man who has learned over a long life that hurry costs more than it saves. When he reached her, he did not ask if she was all right. He could see she was not. He set the thermos and the sack down on a flat stone. He took off his coat. He folded it twice. He laid it on the ground. "Sit," he said. His voice was a low, warm rumble like a wood stove that has been burning all night. She sat. He knelt in front of her slowly, one knee at a time, with the careful economy of a body that knew its own price. He took her swollen ankle in both his hands. His hands were enormous and very gentle. "Not broken," he said after a moment. "Bad sprain. You'll be off it 3 days, maybe 4. How can you tell 40 years shoeing horses? Same joints mostly." He sat back on his heels and looked at her. And for a long moment, something passed across his face that was older than the moment itself. A kind of recognition. "You're his sister." "I am." He nodded slowly. He did not say anything else for a while. He uncapped the thermos and poured a small steaming cup of coffee and handed it to her. And she took it with both hands and held it under her chin and let the steam warm her face. "My name is Frank Buchalter," he said at last. "I keep the general store down in the hollow. I've known your brother for 31 years. I did not know he was your brother until last Tuesday, when Ellis Hargrove came by my store and told me the man I knew as Walter Reed had a sister coming up from Asheville and that her name was Opal and that I should keep an eye on the old Whitfield place." He paused. He looked down at his hands. They were a working man's hands. They had the small white scars of a lifetime of nails and wire. "I would like," he said, "if you would let me to drive you back down to my truck and help you get to the inn where you can put that ankle up properly. And then tomorrow, if you are willing, I would like to come back up here with my grandson and help you cut the rest of this brush. And I would like, if it is not too much, to bring a few people with us." Opal looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Why?" "Because Walter Reed," he said quietly, "kept the porch light burning at his cabin every night for 31 years that I knew him. And I asked him once who he was waiting on, and he said, 'Frank, I am not waiting on anybody. I am only making sure that if she ever looks up at this ridge at night from wherever she is, she sees one yellow light that belongs to her.' And I did not understand him then, but I understand him this morning. And I would like, ma'am, with your permission, to bring some people up here who would like to understand him too." The coffee in her hands was hot. The pain in her ankle was a low, steady drum. The blue ribbon and the brass key lay against her wrist like the small, warm hand of a child. "All right, Mr. Buchalter," she said. "Thank you." He brought his grandson the next morning. He brought 4 other men besides. He brought a woman named Bear, who had baked an apple pie at 4 in the morning and brought it up the mountain in a basket lined with a dish towel. None of them came inside the room behind the smokehouse. None of them asked. They worked in the meadow from sunrise until noon, cutting brush, dragging brush, hauling fieldstones off the path. And they did it the way mountain people do work for one another, which is to say, without speeches and without asking what it was for. Opal sat on a folding chair Frank had brought from his truck. Her ankle was wrapped in a clean white bandage propped on a milk crate. She poured coffee from the thermos when anyone came near. She thanked them each by name as they left at the end of the day, and not one of them would take a single dollar. That night, she sat alone again in the small earthen room with the lantern turned low, and she untied the twine on the next letter in the stack. She read for 2 hours. She learned about her brother's first job at a sawmill outside Boone, under a name that was not his. She learned about the cabin he had built with his own hands the year she got married. She learned that he had read every book in the Cedar Hollow library twice in alphabetical order, both times because he wrote. He had needed something large to walk through. She learned too what he had been doing all those years besides waiting. He had been watching Silas Thorne. He had been watching Silas Thorne's son Hollis after Silas died in 1991. He had been keeping a ledger. She found the ledger on the 4th day. She had not meant to find it that day. She had been sitting on the cot leafing through an old hymn book she had pulled from the shelf. A worn black book with a cracked spine and a dried wildflower had slipped out from between the pages and fallen into her lap. She picked it up. It was a violet. She knew without knowing how that he had pressed it there for her. She turned the page from which it had fallen, and there, taped neatly to the inner margin, was a small square of acetate film. She held it up to the lantern. She could not quite see what was on it, but she could see that it was something. She turned more pages. There were more squares. Some were strips of microfilm. Some were small photographs no bigger than a postage stamp. She counted 23 before she stopped counting. The hymn book, which had sat in plain sight on a shelf in a hole in the ground for 31 years, was a record of something. A long, patient, meticulous record of something. She knelt by the cot, ignoring the protest of her knees, and she ran her hand along the underside of the wooden floor planks until her fingertips found what she was already certain she would find. A seam, a panel, a piece of the floor that did not belong to the rest of it. She pried it up with the iron poker by the door. Beneath the panel, in a shallow cavity lined with cedar shavings, lay a tin biscuit box and a leather-bound ledger as thick as her hand. The ledger had a strip of red ribbon tied around it. Wendell had marked the cover with a single word in fountain pen: truth. She opened the biscuit box first because she was, after all, a practical woman, and she nearly dropped the lid. The box was full of money, cash, banded stacks of it, 20s and 50s and hundreds neat as a deck of cards. She did not count. She would count later. But she could see at a glance that it was thousands of dollars, many thousands. She set the box aside. She lifted the ledger into her lap. She untied the red ribbon. She opened the cover. The first page was a letter. "Sister," it said, "what follows is the truth, as I have gathered it over 40 years about the family that took our brother from us and about the family that helped them. Read until you cannot read anymore. Then put it down and pick it up again. There are things in here you will not want to know. There is one of them you must." She turned the page. The ledger had been kept the way an old country bookkeeper keeps a ledger. Dates down the left margin. Names in a column. Sums in another. Notations in Wendell's careful hand. It began in 1968, the year he disappeared, and ran forward through the decades in unbroken sequence. The bribe Silas Thorne had paid to a county commissioner in 1971. The fire at the Pruitt place in 1973 that had run a widow off her own farm. The mysterious flood at the Mercer's irrigation pump in 1979. The forged signatures. The strong-arm sales. The small dirty engine of a small dirty empire that had been quietly buying up the south face of this mountain for half a century. After 1991, the handwriting changed only slightly. Wendell had begun keeping the ledger on Hollis Thorne Silas's son the year his father died. It was on a page dated October 1974 that she stopped. The date was 6 years after he had left. She had been 23, married to Harold a year, pregnant with Margaret, though she had not yet known it. The entry read in her brother's neat black ink, October 14th, 1974. Daddy signed the homestead over to Silas Thorne today, in exchange for Silas's written assurance that Opal May would be left alone. Daddy got nothing for the land. He did not need to. He had already been paid in 1968 the night he sent me away. The sum recorded in Silas's own books, which I have now seen with my own eyes, was $4,000. Daddy used it to pay off the back taxes on the farm and to buy himself a new truck. He kept the rest in a coffee can under the floor of the tool shed until the day he died. Opal closed the ledger. She closed her eyes. Her father had not lost the homestead in 1974 to the bank the way her family had always said. Her father had sold it, and he had not sold it for her safety alone. He had sold his son for cash. He had sold Wendell, and then 6 years later, he had sold the land, and the $4,000 he had taken for his only boy had bought him a Ford pickup with a red stripe down the side that Opal remembered even now as the truck he had been most proud of in his life. She sat in the small earthen room with the lantern burning low, and she felt something inside her, something she had carried for 58 years, without knowing she had been carrying it, set itself down. The story of her childhood, as she had always told it, was not the story that had happened. The father she had mourned at her graveside in 1989 had been a different man than the father she had buried. The brother she had blamed for leaving had been the only one in that house who had stayed. She did not cry. She had cried already. She blew out the lantern. She climbed onto the cot. She held the brass key against her chest in the dark, and she waited for morning. Morning came with the sound of a different engine. It was a heavy engine, a big diesel idling at the gate. She heard it from inside the room. She climbed the steps in her sweater and her bandaged ankle, and she pushed open the steel door, and she came up into the meadow in time to see a white Cadillac Escalade parked behind Frank Buckhalter's truck, and two men standing in the grass looking down toward the chimney. One of them was a county sheriff's deputy in a tan uniform. The other was a tall man in his 70s in a charcoal sport coat with silver hair combed back from a tanned forehead and a kind of practiced ease that made her think of a salesman. He was holding a folded sheaf of papers in one hand. He turned when he heard her come up out of the brush, and he smiled at her, the wide, easy smile of a man who has never in his life expected to be denied anything. "Ma'am," he said, "I sure am sorry to bother you out here. My name's Hollis Thorne. I represent the development concern that holds a promissory note on this property. I was hoping I might find someone here who could direct me to the next of kin." Opal stood very still. He did not recognize her. He had no reason to. He had not seen her since she was 16 years old. He had been told his whole adult life that she had died in an automobile accident in 1969. 6 months after her brother had taken the blame for the cash box and vanished. Wendell had spread that story himself with their father's help, and Silas Thorne had believed it, and Hollis had been raised believing it. To the man standing in front of her now, she was no one. A caretaker, perhaps. A neighbor. An old woman the bank had sent up to look at a foreclosure. She let her shoulders round forward. She let her mouth go a little slack. She put one hand on the small of her back the way the women at the senior center did when they were tired. She made her voice high and uncertain. "I'm just looking after the place a little, sir. The family asked me to keep an eye." He nodded sympathetically. He produced a business card from an inner pocket and held it out to her with 2 fingers the way you offer a treat to a dog you do not entirely trust. "Well, ma'am, if you would be so kind as to pass this along, I would surely appreciate it. The note is past due. We have a hearing scheduled at the county courthouse on Wednesday morning at 9. Family doesn't need to be there if they don't want to be. The judge will sort it all out either way." He smiled again. He turned. He walked back to the Escalade with the deputy at his shoulder, and they got in, and the diesel engine murmured to life, and they rolled away down the grass beside the cut chain. And Opal May Whitfield Calloway stood in the wet meadow grass with a stranger's business card in her hand and watched them go. She held very still until the sound of the engine was gone. Then she walked back down into the small earthen room beneath the smokehouse, and she sat down at the wooden table, and she set the business card beside the ledger marked Truth. And she picked up the burner phone Margaret had given her, and she dialed Ellis Hargrove's office. The line rang once. Then her phone buzzed in her hand with a different call coming in. Margaret, her daughter in Charlotte, who never called on a Tuesday. Opal answered. "Mama," Margaret said, and her voice was thin and high and frightened, the voice she had used as a 4-year-old, afraid of the dark. "Mama, a man just called the house. He said he was from a development company. He said he hoped you were enjoying your visit to the mountains. He said he hoped you would come home soon. He said it like he was wishing me well, Mama, but Mama, he knew the boys' names. He knew where they go to school." Opal closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the maples on the hillside above the meadow, and somewhere down in the hollow on a porch, she could not see an old yellow light. The one her brother had left her. The one he had asked Frank Buckhalter and Bear and the others to keep burning in his absence was being lit again for the night. She opened her eyes. She picked up the brass key on its blue ribbon. She held it tight in her fist. "Sweetheart," she said, and her voice did not shake. "You listen to me. You take those boys and you go to your Aunt Caroline's tonight. You do not tell anyone where. You stay there until I call you back. Do you understand me, Mama, what is happening?" "What is happening," Opal said quietly, "is that your mother is about to do something your mother should have done 58 years ago." She did not sleep that night. She sat at the wooden table with the ledger open in front of her, and the burner phone face down beside it, and she worked. She worked the way her mother had worked at a kitchen table during the long winter. Daddy had been laid off from the mill with the lamp turned low and the coffee growing cold, and a pencil tucked behind one ear. She copied the most important entries from the ledger onto a yellow legal pad Frank Buckhalter had brought up to her the day before. She arranged the small square photographs from the Hymnbook in order of their dates. She wrote a single page of her own in her own steady hand, beginning with the words, "My name is Opal May Whitfield Calloway. And on a Sunday in March of 1968, when I was 16 years old, I walked across the back pasture to the Thorn farm to return my mother's mixing bowl, and what I saw there has waited 58 years to be spoken." It was the hardest sentence she had ever written. She wrote it without crying. She had cried already. She drove down into Cedar Hollow at first light with the ledger and the Hymnbook and the legal pad in the canvas suitcase on the passenger seat. The ankle was still swollen, but she could press the brake well enough. Ellis Hargrove met her at the door of his office in his shirt sleeves. He had been up most of the night himself. There was a second man with him in the small office above the bank, a younger man in a dark suit with a leather briefcase open on the desk and a face like a hawk that has not eaten in a week. "Mrs. Calloway," Ellis said, "this is Wyatt Penrose. He is a senior prosecutor with the state attorney's office. He drove down from Raleigh last night. I called him at home. He knew your brother by reputation, though he never met him. He has been waiting 9 years for what is in that suitcase." The prosecutor stood. He did not smile. He held out his hand, and his handshake was brief and very firm. "Ma'am," he said, "your brother sent me an anonymous package in 2017. Photographs, photocopies of 3 pages of a ledger, a typed note that said, 'More to come when the time is right.' I have kept that package in a locked drawer for 9 years. I have wondered every January whether the man who sent it was still alive. I am sorry to learn this morning that he is not. But I would be grateful with your permission if you would let me look at what he sent the rest of the way." Opal lifted the canvas suitcase onto the desk. She set the ledger marked Truth on top of it. She set the Hymnbook beside it. She placed the legal pad with her own statement on top of them both. the way a woman lays the last clean linen on a table that has been waiting for company a long time. "Mr. Penrose," she said, "please look as long as you need to." They worked through the morning. Ellis brought coffee from across the street. The prosecutor's hawk face grew quieter and quieter as he read, and his pen moved faster. And at one point he stopped and looked up and asked Ellis if there was a telephone he could use in private. And Ellis pointed him to the inner office, and the prosecutor made 3 phone calls in a row and came back with the look of a man who has just been handed, after a long lean season, the meal he had stopped believing in. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I want to be careful with you. I do not want to give you false comfort. But what your brother put together over 40 years is the most complete record of organized rural corruption I have ever held in my hands. There are sitting officials in this county whose names appear in here as recipients of cash payments going back to 1979. There is a county judge who is at this moment scheduled to preside over your foreclosure hearing tomorrow morning. He will not be presiding over it. I am going to make sure of that before I leave this office." Opal nodded once. "There is one more thing, Mr. Penrose." "Yes, ma'am. A man called my daughter yesterday evening in Charlotte. He spoke of my grandchildren by name. I would like to know what can be done about that." The prosecutor's face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "Ma'am," he said, "by sundown tonight, a state investigator and a North Carolina Highway Patrol cruiser will be parked outside your daughter's sister-in-law's house. They will remain there until this matter is concluded. I will see to it personally. Thank you." He looked at her for a long moment. He was perhaps 50 years old. He had the tired, careful eyes of a man who had spent a long career losing more cases than he won. "Mrs. Calloway," he said quietly, "your brother was a remarkable man." "Yes," she said, "he was." The hearing the next morning was set for 9 o'clock in the small county courthouse on the square. Opal arrived at 1:45. She wore the blue dress her mother had made for her the year she turned 20, the one she had been married in, the one she had not put on in 30 years. It still fit almost. Frank Buckhalter drove her. Bea sat in the back seat with a paper bag of biscuits she had baked at 4 in the morning. Ellis Hargrove met them on the courthouse steps in a dark wool suit with a small white flower in his lapel. Wyatt Penrose was already inside. So was Hollis Thorne. He was sitting at the plaintiff's table with 2 lawyers in expensive ties. He did not look up when Opal came in. He was reading something on his phone with the small private smile of a man who already knows how the morning is going to go. She sat down in the second row of the gallery. She put her hands in her lap. She closed them around the brass key on its faded blue ribbon, which she had tied that morning around her wrist beneath the cuff of her dress. The judge who took the bench at 9 o'clock sharp was not the judge whose name was printed on the docket. He was a tall, thin woman with silver hair pulled back tight and reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead. Her name, the bailiff said, was the Honorable Marcella Voss, Senior Superior Court Judge sitting by special assignment from the next county over. She did not explain why. She did not need to. The 2 lawyers at the plaintiff's table glanced at each other once very quickly, and Hollis Thorne looked up from his phone for the first time, and the small private smile faltered. Wyatt Penrose stood. He introduced himself. He requested permission to address the court briefly on a matter that had bearing on the proceeding. He was granted it. He laid a single thick folder on the bench in front of Judge Voss. He laid a second folder on the table in front of Hollis Thorne's lawyers. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room was very quiet as the judge read. Hollis Thorne turned in his chair to look behind him for the first time, scanning the gallery, perhaps looking for the deputy who had escorted him on Tuesday, perhaps looking for some understanding of what was happening. And his eyes passed across the second row of the gallery, and they passed across a small white-haired woman in a blue dress, and they passed on, and then they came back. He looked at her. He looked at her face and her hands and the small blue ribbon at her wrist. Opal looked back at him steadily. She did not lower her eyes. She let him look. She let him look long enough. And she watched in real time as the man Hollis Thorne had always understood himself to be slid away from the man he was now going to have to become. His mouth opened slightly. The color drained from his face in two slow stages, first from his cheeks and then from his forehead, until his tanned skin had the gray-yellow look of old paper. He turned back toward the front of the courtroom. He whispered something to the lawyer on his left. The lawyer did not whisper anything back. The lawyer was still reading the folder Wyatt Penrose had set down. Hollis Thorne stood up. "Your Honor," his lawyer said quickly, "may we have a brief recess?" "Sit down, Counselor," Judge Voss said without looking up. "Mr. Thorne, sit down." He sat. He sat the way a man sits when he has just discovered that the floor he has been standing on for 58 years has been hollow the whole time. The hearing did not last 40 minutes. Judge Voss reviewed the promissory note offered by the plaintiff and ruled it a forgery from the bench within 10. She dismissed the foreclosure with prejudice. She ordered the court file sealed, pending a criminal referral, and she instructed Mr. Penrose that she would expect his office to file appropriate charges by the end of the week. The two state investigators who had been standing along the back wall the entire morning, whom Opal had not noticed until that moment, walked forward at a signal from the judge and took Hollis Thorne quietly by the elbows and led him out through a side door of the courtroom without a word. He did not look at her again. He did not have to. Opal sat in the second row of the gallery in her mother's blue dress with her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the small ordinary engine of justice do its small ordinary work, and she understood with a kind of quiet wonder that it was finished, that 58 years of waiting had ended in 40 minutes of paperwork on an ordinary Wednesday morning in a small county courthouse in the mountains of North Carolina, with the smell of floor wax in the air and a fly buzzing somewhere up against the high window behind the judge. She did not feel triumphant. She had thought she might. She felt instead a kind of soft, astonished tiredness, like a woman who has been carrying a heavy basket up a long hill and has only just been allowed to set it down. Ellis Hargrove drove her back to the homestead that afternoon. They did not speak for most of the ride. There was nothing left in either of them that needed to be said aloud. When he pulled the truck up to the gate, she put her hand on his arm and thanked him. And he covered her hand with his own and squeezed it once the way her brother might have, and he said simply, "He would be proud of you, Opal May." "I know," she said. "I know he would." She walked down the meadow alone in the late afternoon light. There was one letter she had not yet read. It had been at the very bottom of the stack, tied with its own piece of twine marked in Wendell's careful hand with a single word: last. She sat at the wooden table in the small earthen room. She lit the kerosene lantern. She broke the seal. The letter was short, 2 pages only. "Sister," it began, "if you have read this far, then the others have done their work, and so have you. And so at last have I. There is one thing left I want you to know. The money in the tin box under the floor is not mine. It is yours. When Daddy sold this land to Silas Thorne in 1974, the sum he was paid in cash was $22,000. He used some of it to settle his back taxes. He used some of it to buy the truck. The rest he put in a coffee can and buried under the floor of the tool shed. And after he died, Mama found it there and did not know what to do with it. And so she put it back, and after Mama died and the bank took the house in 1989, I went back one night, sister, and I dug it up. That money was meant to be your inheritance. It was the price of this land, and this land was meant to be ours, and the half of it that should have come to you should never have gone into Daddy's pocket. So I took it, and I have kept it for you for 37 years, and I have added to it every year what I could spare. I worked at the sawmill. I cut firewood. I mended fences for the Mercer place and the Pruitt place and the people up at the Methodist camp in the summers. I lived on next to nothing because I had nothing to live for except the day this box would be yours. Take it, Opal May. Build something with it, or do not build anything with it. Give it to Margaret. Give it to your grandsons, give it away. It does not matter. It was never about the money. It was about getting it home to you. It is home now. So am I. The porch light is yours now. Keep it on for someone. Your brother, who never left you, Wendell. She held the letter for a long time. She did not weep. She had wept already, and she would weep again, but not at this moment. At this moment, what she felt was a strange, clean stillness, the kind of stillness that comes into a kitchen the morning after a long sickness, when the windows have been opened and the air has been let in. She folded the letter. She slipped it back into its envelope. She tied the twine. Then she rose from the table and she climbed the steps and she came up into the meadow into the long red light of an October sundown. And she walked slowly with her ankles still wrapped up the slope to where the chimney stood. And she set her hand against the cold stone and she said very quietly into the dusk, "I'm home, brother. I brought us both home." She did not rebuild the farmhouse. She was 75 years old, and the farmhouse had been gone too long to be brought back the way it was. What she did instead was smaller, and she thought truer. She had a small cabin raised in the spring, on the rise above the chimney by Frank Buchalter's grandson, and 3 of his cousins with money from the tin box that she did not begrudge spending. It had 2 rooms and a porch that faced east. The porch had a yellow bulb in a wrought iron sconce above the front door. She kept it burning every night. Margaret came up in May with her husband and the boys. They stayed a week. Margaret stood on the porch on the first evening with her mother. And she did not say anything at all about Pinecrest. And she did not say anything at all about the stairs in the apartment in Asheville. And after a long while she only said, "Mama, I never met him, and I miss him." And Opal put her arm around her daughter's waist and said, "He met you, sweetheart. He met you the night I brought you home from the hospital. He just never told us." The boys ran in the meadow until the fireflies came out. They were 13 and 15. They were too old by their own count for fireflies. They chased them anyway. She had a small brass plaque set into the stone of the chimney that summer. It read simply, "Whitfield, 1902, still here." She planted a row of dogwoods along the path down to the smokehouse. She left the steel door unlocked. She did not need to lock it anymore. The ledger she gave to Wyatt Penrose. He used what he needed of it in the prosecution of Hollis Thorne and 3 county officials and a sitting judge from the neighboring district, and a state senator who had not expected at his age to spend any portion of his retirement in a federal courthouse. The criminal trials would take 3 years. Opal did not attend most of them. She testified once in her mother's blue dress, and she told the truth as she had written it down, and she went home. Frank Buchalter came up to the cabin every Thursday for coffee. Bea came on Sundays with a pie. The old men who had cut brush in the meadow that first week came up now and then to fix a hinge to clear a downed limb to sit on the porch in the evening and not say very much. None of them ever asked her for $1. None of them ever would. She sat alone on the porch on a warm September evening, just shy of a year from the morning the letter had come through her mail slot in Asheville. The brass key hung on its blue ribbon from a nail beside the door, where she had hung it the night the cabin was finished. She had not worn it on her wrist since. She did not need to anymore. It hung where anyone coming up the steps could see it in the soft yellow light of the porch bulb, the way a candle sits in a windowsill at Christmas, meant to be seen from a long way off. The crickets were loud in the high grass. The smell of wood smoke drifted up from somewhere down in the hollow, faint and sweet. Out across the meadow, the first fireflies of the evening were rising up out of the blue stem, one and then another, and then a slow, patient drift of them. The way Wendell had told her in one of his letters, they had risen the night she was born, when their mother had stood on the porch of the old farmhouse with a newborn baby in her arms, and Daddy had stood beside her, and Wendell, 4 years old, had sat on the top step and watched the lights come on in the field, and had asked Mama, "Are those for her?" And their mother had said, "Yes, son, all of them." Opal rocked slowly in the porch chair Frank Buchalter had built her. She watched the fireflies. She watched the porch light glow against the wood of the porch boards. She thought about all the people in the world who were at that very moment somewhere sitting alone in a room and believing that nobody had ever waited for them. She thought about how many of them were wrong. If you have ever been left, friend, in any of the ways a person can be left by a parent, by a brother, by a husband, by a friend, by a life you thought you understood, I want you to consider before you sleep tonight the possibility that the leaving you remember was not the whole story. The possibility that someone somewhere kept a porch light burning for you in a window you could not see. The possibility that what looked like the back of someone walking away was all that time the silhouette of a body standing between you and a darker thing you never even knew was coming. That is what I want to ask you tonight. Who in your life kept a light on for you in a window you never knew about? And whose window now might be waiting for you to leave one on for them? Tell me if you would. Tell me their name in the comments below. Tell me what they did or what you only later understood they did. Your stories matter in this place. They are the porch lights we keep on for each other. And if this story found you in a quiet hour when you needed it and stayed with you the way the best ones do, please consider subscribing so that the next one finds you too. Sleep well, friend. Somewhere somebody left the light on for you.